Hi everyone, it's Mr. Moreau here with a little review video for some vocabulary on food chains and food webs, and then also an introduction of a new concept called food pyramids. So on the screen now you can see a very familiar picture of a food chain. We've seen this before, and I've written the vocabulary on this so we can see that the food chain begins with the producers. Now, the reason the producers are the first step in the food chain is because they are the first living thing. You do not count the sun as the first step of the food chain. The food chain begins with the first living thing. In this food chain, the first living thing are the plants, which we call producers because they can make their own energy. They can make their own food. Well, the producers are eaten by the primary consumers, and that is why there's an arrow going from the producer to the primary consumer. The arrow shows which direction energy moves. Energy goes from producers to primary consumers when the primary consumers eat the producers. The next step in the food chain are the secondary consumers, followed by the tertiary consumers, followed by the quaternary consumers, and so on. So those are the terms that you see most often. We really don't go past the quaternary consumer because usually there's not enough energy available to support more and more predators. So usually you only see about maybe 2, 3, 4 steps of the food chain. Now, a special part of this food chain would be down at the bottom, the decomposers. Now, they are special because they are not a predator, but rather they will break down the dead material in the ecosystem and return those molecules into the ground. You can see that the word nutrients is used there to describe those molecules, so that the producers can use them to start this food chain all over again. Now, what you do not see in this picture of the food chain is something that I think is an important thing to understand. You only see an arrow going from the quaternary consumer to the decomposer. However, in real life, anytime something is not eaten, but it dies, its body will be broken down by the decomposers. So, if you want, you can actually add arrows from everything to the decomposers. That means that no matter what the organism is, decomposers will break them down after they die. Now, that makes the picture a little bit messy, so I'm going to erase those arrows just to make the picture more clean. But you do need to understand that that is how decomposers work. Anytime anything dies, decomposers will break them down. All right, the next group of vocab words that you see on our screen is what I've written in yellow, below each organism. Now, again, like we said before, the producers are the first step of the food chain, and the steps of the food chain we can also call trophic levels. So the first trophic level, the second trophic level, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. Usually we do not call the decomposers a specific trophic level. That's because with all of those arrows that can go from anything to decomposers, it gets a little confusing with deciding what trophic level the decomposers are at any time. Okay, so that list of red vocabulary terms and yellow vocabulary terms we have learned before, but now it's easy to see them together on the food chain. However, this food chain is very simple. In real life, an ecosystem has more than just one food chain. So a picture like this food web makes more sense. All this picture is many food chains put together. That's all a food web is. A food web is many food chains put together. Now, the interesting thing I'd like to show you about a food web is this. If I pick out one food chain in this food web, let's see what that looks like. We start with the first trophic level, the plants, getting eaten by birds, and the birds get eaten by the snakes. So we can see this path represents one food chain. And if we label this, we've got the first trophic level, second trophic level, and third trophic level. All right, let's pick another food chain. How about if the plants get eaten by the insects, insects get eaten by spiders, spiders eaten by birds, and birds eaten by snakes? If I label those steps with a different color, we have the first trophic level, the second trophic level, the third trophic level, the fourth trophic level, and the fifth trophic level. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The snakes, which is just one kind of animal, are the third trophic level and the fifth trophic level. That shows us that there can be a lot of overlap of food chains in one food web. A food web can show us many food chains that overlap. So the same animal can be part of different trophic levels. That means that in real life, ecology is more complex. It's not like one simple food chain. A food web shows us that real life is more complex because food chains can overlap. Now, finally, we have this new idea of these pyramids. Okay? Now, these pyramids are going to prove to be a helpful shape for us because of this information. Now, the food that we eat, when it enters our body, we do not keep all of that energy inside our body. You can see that about 50% of that energy is lost because we poop it out. So when we poop, we lose about 50% of whatever we eat. We only keep about 50%. But look at what is left over. About 40% of it is used for when we do all kinds of things. When we walk, run, talk, move, anything that requires energy, we use the energy from our food. So 40% is gone for that. That leaves us with only 10%, and that's the special one, because that means that only 10% of the energy that we eat, we actually keep inside our body, which we can store in our cells or we can use to grow. Okay, so only 10% of the energy that is in the food that we eat actually stays in our body. So that means that if we think about the shape of a pyramid, that is going to be helpful for us to understand the steps of the food chain representing different amounts of energy. Now, let's talk about the unit of energy. If you want to measure the length of something, you might use the unit of centimeters. If you want to measure the mass of something, you would use the unit of grams. Well, if you want to measure the amount of energy in something, you would use an energy called the joule, and the symbol is J. Okay? Now, there are other energy units, but a joule is the one that most biologists use. And if a biologist were to do an experiment on all of the plants in the ecosystem, he or she may discover that, let's say there are 1 million joules of energy that are stored inside of all the cells in all the plants in this ecosystem. Now, because of this rule of 10%, which we talked about before, that means if the same experiment was done on all of these giraffes would only have 1,000 joules of energy inside all of their cells. And the same experiment is done on the lions, you would find only 10,000 joules of energy inside of all of their cells. See how, as you go from one level to the next, only 10% of the energy moves from one level to the next level. And this is actually something we can add to our food chain and food web. So when we talk about the primary consumer eating the primary consumer can only keep 10% of the energy from each producer that it eats. The mouse could only keep 10% of the energy from each grasshopper that it eats. That usually suggests that in order to survive, when a mouse is ready to eat, it really needs to eat about 10 grasshoppers in order to get enough energy. Back down to our pyramids here. Because of our energy pyramid, we can now talk about a pyramid that shows us the number of organisms at each level. Let's say we go to an ecosystem and count the number of producers, and we find 5,000 plants. If we look in the same environment, how many giraffes would we find? Probably 10% of that. So we would only find 500 giraffes. And in that same ecosystem, we expect to only find 50 lions. Again, it goes down by a factor of 10% each time. Because if only 10% of the energy goes to the next level, that means only 10% of the number of organisms can survive at the next level. Finally, this allows us to also talk about a pyramid that shows us the mass at each trophic level. So this one kind of requires our imagination, but if you go to this ecosystem and gather all the plants together and put them on a scale and weigh them, let's say they turn out to be, about 20 million kilograms. Okay, now if we do the same thing with all the giraffes, put them all together on a scale, every giraffe in the ecosystem, you'd probably get not 20 million, but only 10% of that. That's 2 million kilograms of giraffe. And then if we get all the lions together and put them on a scale and weigh them, we would probably see only about 200,000 kilograms. Again, see that we are going down by 10% each time, because if there is less and less energy as you move up the food chain, that means there are fewer and fewer a number of animals as you move up the food chain. That, of course, also again means there's less and less mass as a total at each trophic level as you move up the food chain. So this rule of 10% really impacts how many species you see at each trophic level, the mass at each trophic level, and the energy available at each trophic level. So that's everything we need to know about our vocabulary and our math with food chains, food webs, food pyramids. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.